Hello, and welcome back to the Dialexicon podcast, where we critically engage in philosophy and correlate philosophy research to contemporary issues at an easy to understand and digestible level. My name is Saurish and I'm your host. This week we have with us Dr. Sophia Dandelet, who is an incoming assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Cambridge and previously a Bersoff Faculty Fellow at NYU. Hi, Dr. Dandelet. How are you today?
Hi, Sourish. Good. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for your time and for being here today. Before we begin our discussion, which is going to be on feminist philosophy and I guess ethics in general, how did you get into philosophy? What stood out to you? And maybe kind of talking about like how your initial introduction to philosophy, maybe.
Yeah, for sure. So coming into college, I basically had no experience with philosophy at all. There wasn't really a philosophy class in my high school or anything like that. But there was a kind of general philosophy breadth requirement at UC Berkeley where I did my undergrad. So, mainly just to fulfill that requirement, but also out of curiosity, I took this philosophy class called Intro to Early Modern. This is where you read philosophers like Descartes, Hume, Kant, sometimes Spinoza. And really, I think the first philosophy that I really fell in love with was what's sometimes called skepticism. So it has roots going, far back beyond the early modern period. But Cartesian skepticism is pretty famous. A lot of philosophers talk about it. And there are a number of different ways to describe the skeptical challenge. But one way to present it is the skeptical challenge shows us an incompatibility between three things that we just normally think of when we think of knowledge. So the first thing we ordinarily think about knowledge is that you can't know something if you might be wrong about it, right? That seems pretty commonsensical, right? So if you think that you left your keys in your pocket, but you might be wrong about that, then we want to say you don't really know that you left your keys in your pocket, right? The other thing we normally think about knowledge is that you know quite a lot of things, right? So like I know that I'm participating in a podcast with you. I know that there's a mug on my table. I know that my cat is in the room with me, and there's a lot of other kind of more interesting, complicated things that I probably know too. But the basic thought here is we know quite a lot of things. And then the third idea that gives rise to the puzzle is that for almost anything you think, it's possible that you're wrong about that thing, right? So this is the sort of thing that Descartes and a lot of the other philosophers who have posed skeptical challenges over the years have really been pressing us to see. So, something as obvious seeming as that there is a cup on the table, you could be wrong about that if, for instance, you were being deceived by an evil demon. That's one of the possibilities that Descartes considers. So if you take these three ideas together, right, you get an inconsistency. They can't all be true. And so you feel some pressure to give one of them up. And this, when I kind of first encountered this skeptical puzzle, it kind of blew my mind, because what really struck me is that these three ideas about knowledge are not really like deeply buried in our psyches or anything like that, right? I think they're really quite accessible bits of our normal way of thinking about knowledge. And also, when you take the time to put them side by side, it's not hard to see why they're incompatible, right? So sometimes if you're working with like a lot of premises and some of them have a really complicated logical form, it can be hard to see that taken together, they're going to get you to a contradiction. But in this case, it's not hard to see, right? If you take these three things and you put them side by side, it's really obvious that they can't all be true. But until I took this class, it had just never occurred to me to put all of these three things side by side. And therefore, I had never thought to reckon with how I was going to resolve this puzzle that arose just from my ordinary pre-theoretical commitments about knowledge. So I think the more general thing that I really loved about this experience is I saw that philosophy could sort of radically transform your picture of the world just by getting you to re-examine your own commitments. And that seemed to me like just a really powerful and kind of magical thing. So that was kind of my first entry point into the discipline. And I just, yeah, I loved it right away. I changed my major after taking the one class. And yeah.
Yeah, and I think like that's really, really cool because a lot of people have similar experiences, although like I think for a lot of maybe students who get introduced to philosophy at an earlier age, it's always through like ethical problems, like the trolley problem. Like I think the trolley problem is a really great example of getting people excited about philosophy because like that's a real dilemma that, I mean, obviously you're not going to have to face the trolley problem, but like it is a real dilemma to like kind of think about what you would do in those situations and kind of a way to get into philosophy. So that's really interesting because it's connected in a way, right? So now I want to get into our topic today, kind of about feminist philosophy, which has kind of taken the streets recently, given what's the climate right now, current political climate in the United States. So I want to ask what feminist philosophy is and how it's changed over time, and what it means to be a feminist, and whether or not there's a distinction between being pro-feminism and also being a feminist. I've heard often on Twitter that there is a distinction maybe between those two, and I'm just trying to clarify whether or not that's actually the case.
Interesting. Okay, cool. So I'll try to take those questions one by one. So what is feminist philosophy? I think you'll probably get different answers to this question from different philosophers because it's not like we have a big book of definitions somewhere that we've agreed on. But as I understand it, feminist philosophy is a pretty broad subdiscipline within philosophy. So, I would count as feminist philosophy pretty much any work that takes some of the distinctive methods of philosophical investigation and applies them to questions, the answering of which might be essential for addressing and understanding gendered injustice. And I think works that fit that definition can be found in pretty much all the traditional subdisciplines of philosophy. So you find feminist philosophy within metaphysics, within philosophy of language, within naturally ethics and political philosophy, and within philosophy of science, just to name a few examples. So feminist philosophy, when I explain what it is to my students, I often say like, it doesn't really contrast with those other traditional subdivisions of philosophy, because you can find feminist philosophy in pretty much all of those subdivisions. It's basically just any kind of work of philosophy that engages in some way with issues that are of critical importance for understanding and addressing gendered injustice. Yeah. Another question that you asked, well, first I'll ask, do you want to ask any follow-up questions about that or any thoughts?
Well, yeah. So I think like it's kind of curious, or I guess I'm kind of curious on what you mean, kind of how feminist philosophy is almost injected into other forms of philosophy. Like, for example, you're giving out metaphysics and different branches of philosophy. What does it mean for feminist philosophy to be included in all of those and not to contradict? Like, how can it not contradict certain branches of philosophy? Is it just about like inclusion or something like that, or what really is that when we say that it can be, I guess, almost together with different branches of philosophy?
Yeah, so the traditional branches of philosophy are defined like very roughly by their subject matter. So epistemology, for instance, is philosophy about belief and knowledge. Ethics is philosophy about what it takes to live a good life. Metaphysics, I find it a little bit harder to say what metaphysics is exactly, but very broadly, it's like inquiring into the nature of different kinds of things. So some metaphysicians work on the nature of time. So just to give you an example of a work of feminist philosophy that's in one of those subdisciplines, There's a very influential paper by a philosopher named Sally Haslinger, who's at MIT, called, oh, I always get the title wrong because it's kind of a long title, but it's roughly Gender and Race, What Are They? What Do We Want Them to Be? So this is a paper that is in metaphysics because it's asking about the nature of gender and the nature of race. It's asking, what are these categories exactly? What kinds of categories are they, right? But it's also a work of feminist philosophy because it's at least plausible that it's really important to understand what gender is if we're interested in advancing the aims of gender justice, right? So this is a work that's simultaneously a work of metaphysics and also a work of feminist philosophy. So it's not like it has to be one or the other.
Okay, that makes sense. And then I guess like maybe kind of talking about the distinctions, or I guess we can talk about how it's changed over a period of time. And yeah, I guess how it's changed over a period of time, and maybe the relationship that there is with feminist philosophy as well as politics. Like, does politics influence the way in which maybe new forms of like, I don't know, papers or new forms of just research in feminist philosophy takes place? Like, is there an intersection between those two?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like, unfortunately, I probably won't be able to give you a super informative answer to this question. Like, I wish I knew more about the kind of intellectual history behind feminist theory. From the little that I know, it seems very plausible that the kind of political climate does have an influence on the sorts of feminist philosophy that gets done. I think you'll see something similar with pretty much any kind of like ethics or political philosophy that intersects with political questions in any way. So, during the Vietnam War, some philosophers were writing about what sorts of things were permissible in the context of war and what makes for a just war, right? So, I think philosophers are just like people who exist in a society and generally read the news and probably get interested in things that are gripping the public consciousness. But I'm not sure I can answer the question in a way that's more detailed than that, unfortunately.
Of course. I mean, I think like to an extent it has to, or I don't know if it has to per se, but like I think there probably are ways in which they're connected. Like, for example, just recently we had a podcast with Dr. Joseph Frigo from Claremont, who does research on race. And so his research is specific on race and politics and how those two things collide. And he was telling about how those two things, because of the way in which politics moves forward, race research also moves forward alongside it. And I think that to an extent that could be pretty true. Like, I'm pretty sure there's probably going to be more research now on maybe the ways in which like Roe v. Wade had an effect on like feminist philosophy, or like just in general, more research there. Although there has been a lot in the past already.
Mm.
But I'm curious about like, and this is maybe, I don't know, this is a really interesting question to ask, or the next one that I'm about to ask, because I feel like there's a lot of misconceptions here. And the question is, can men be feminists? I hear all the time from like people who consider themselves to be feminists that men cannot be feminists because they benefit from the patriarchy. Is that true? And like, just me personally, I feel like the logic is a little off, because like in a similar fashion, it would seem that you cannot be an environmentalist if you drive a car, because obviously that's harmful for the environment. But that seems false, or that is false. So is that analogy also true when it comes to feminism?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. I actually have never heard somebody say that men can't be feminists. Maybe this just goes to show that I'm not very online. Like, I go online to post pictures of my cat on Instagram, and like I read a couple news sites, and that's pretty much it. And I've never heard the view expressed that men can't be feminists. But it does strike me as rather odd, because I would have thought that to be a feminist, you asked earlier, what do you think is involved in being a feminist? As I understand it, it basically takes two things. one component is like a matter of what you believe, and the other component is a matter of how you act. So I think, in order to be a feminist, you've got to recognize that gendered injustice is still a real thing in our world today. So that's the belief component, right? I think you don't really count as a feminist if you're somebody who thinks like, oh, like there's basically no kind of injustice that exists in the world today that is structured mainly along gendered lines, right? And there probably are people who think that, right? I think there are some people who think like, yeah, like once women got the right to vote in America, like gendered injustice was over. And I think you can't really be a feminist if you think that. So that's the belief component. The action component, I think, is in order to be a feminist, you've got to be committed to better understanding what gendered injustice looks like in our world today, because it's not always obvious, right? And you've got to be committed to doing your part to address that injustice. And that might look different for different people, right? What it takes to do one's part towards any given effort is going to depend on, one's starting point, the sort of resources one has, among other things. So, I think men can pretty obviously satisfy those two conditions, right? So a man can think that gendered injustice is real. A man can also be really committed to addressing gendered injustice and understanding better what it is exactly. So yeah, I'm not quite sure why somebody would think that a man couldn't be a feminist.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. And just to clarify, you'd have to satisfy both of those conditions, not just one or the other, right?
Yeah, I mean, you sort of couldn't satisfy the second condition if you didn't already satisfy the first condition, because if you didn't believe that gendered injustice was a thing, then you couldn't really be committed to trying to understand it better or doing your part to fix it, right? Yeah, I guess I should probably amend the definition slightly, because maybe as I put it out, like weird men's rights activisty people might count as like feminists because they think that like gendered injustice is real. It's just that like all of it is injustice towards men, and women are sitting pretty. So I guess you would need to recognize that in order to be a feminist, you would need to recognize that some of the worst forms of gender injustice fall on women and gender minorities, which is not to say that there aren't real kinds of gender injustice that affect men too. I think there absolutely are. And it might be sort of helpful in order to build solidarity around feminist projects to kind of publicize that a bit more.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And I think maybe the reason you haven't heard it as much is I think it's probably with a lot of younger generations, because it's like a lot of people I feel are emotionally like basing their responses and how they feel and spreading their voice based off emotions. And so oftentimes they haven't read into like maybe the actual definitions of feminism or how like men can support it. And so it can feel almost as if men can't. And that's just personally what I've seen. So like it obviously can be different. But I think it's probably among like maybe younger kids who are getting involved, but aren't like getting involved in like the philosophical tradition of feminist philosophy and stuff like that. So like I guess there is like room for learning there. I wanted to talk a little bit about the overturning of Roe v. Wade, and I guess recently just because Biden signed that executive order, and what like that kind of means for women in America right now. Because I've heard a lot about America moving back into the past with this court decision and I guess like the bans from red states. But what does that necessarily mean? And how does this lack of bodily autonomy push America into what many have called the state of humanitarian crisis?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure that I have any special insight to offer on this question, qua philosopher. I mean, just qua like minimally politically aware person. It seems to me obvious that this ruling is like not just terrible for women because of the consequences that it'll have, but also terrible for women because of what it expresses about the way that a certain number of people in this country think, how these people think about women. I think one of the things that is so horrible about this ruling is that it shows like just how little some people in this country are prepared to count women as full people. So that's all really bad. The thing that I've been thinking about to, try and take a slightly more optimistic outlook on the whole thing is this. So, when I first heard about the ruling, it was devastating. It was horrible. And then I had this moment where I thought to myself, like, it's interesting that I'm having this reaction, because as a woman who has only ever lived in California and New York in the United States, and who is about to move to England, like, this ruling is not really going to have an effect on me personally, right? There's like zero chance that this ruling is going to limit my access to an abortion. And then I was thinking, well, it still makes sense to be really devastated about it, because this is going to have really terrible consequences for women who like don't live in progressive urban centers, basically. But then I thought to myself, for the vast majority of those women, Roe v. Wade was never enough. So for the vast majority of women living in like rural places in America, and not just rural places, many more urban places as well, their access to abortion was de facto extremely limited, right? So even though they had a constitutionally protected right to an abortion, it was extremely difficult for them to get one because of lack of resources, because maybe they would still have to go far away from their home to get one, and in order to do that, they would have to pay for childcare and take a day off work, and many of them wouldn't have been able to do that. So there were all of these really serious practical barriers that already existed for women in the vast majority of this country before the Dobbs ruling. And I almost wonder if one maybe silver lining of this situation is that maybe it can help to kind of galvanize women like me, women who are in this privileged position, living in these progressive urban centers where we have easy access to abortion, to do more, to feel more as part of one body with these women who are not in that privileged position. Because the fact of the matter is, Roe v. Wade was never a vast majority of women in this state. And if this ruling can sort of shock more privileged women into seeing that, and galvanize the political will to make changes that will eventually lead to the less privileged women being in a better position than they were before, that would be good. So, obviously, really horrible ruling says terrible things about the state of gender justice in this country. But maybe one silver lining is that it could sort of help to build solidarity across different socioeconomic lines.
Okay, yeah. And I guess I kind of want to touch on this a little bit more, on like this kind of collectivism almost. What power does collectivism have maybe in this field, like in this area? Like how can it benefit? Like, I know obviously support through like protests, the more amount of people there are, the better it is in terms of getting things done and action-based like planning. But how does collectivism specifically in this area create actual change, or like lead to like an area where I guess we can put the bar higher for women, right? Like now we can, rather than just Roe v. Wade now, like we can like set it further out because we've kind of gained more support, right? So how is that beneficial, I guess?
So I'm not I'm not really sure what the like long-term political game looks like for people who want to reinstate and indeed improve access to abortion. Um, I think I would need to like know a lot more about political strategy to be able to say like what the right path towards that sort of outcome might be. Um, I will say on the question of like what, just an ordinary person um, can do in order to help people in light of this ruling. One thing that I've heard from a number of sources that seem pretty trustworthy is that while going to protests is great and all, it might not be the form of action that has the greatest potential to really help the people who most need it. So I think depending on where you live, you can probably find a lot of different sort of grassroots organizations that have sprung up to basically help women who are not going to have access to an abortion after this ruling get abortions. And they take a lot of different forms. Some of them just involve donating money. Some people are even like offering to pick up women from airports who need abortions, like drive them to the clinic, take care of them a bit afterwards. I think these kinds of local initiatives that actually help individual people are probably where we should be devoting most of our energy at this particular moment. Because, protests, I think, are important for all kinds of reasons. But going to a protest isn't really going to directly help any of the people who are going to be in need of an abortion in the coming months and not able to get one. So
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And I guess maybe if you have any ideas for what maybe the youth can do, because a lot of the youth don't have access to maybe to like donation methods, just because, well, normally that goes through parents at a youth level. So is there anything that you could recommend for children, or like, I guess when I say children, like teenagers, and I guess rising adults maybe, for what they can do with this crisis, or how they can help out? Is it just through those methods and like making those methods aware, using their social platforms for that, or what necessarily is it?
yeah, I mean, I think it, a teenager would be able in one way or another to support a lot of these kinds of initiatives that I just talked about. So even if you don't directly have access to a lot of cash, a teenager could, for instance, like bring these organizations to their parents' attention, and ask their parents to donate for like a birthday or some other sort of occasion, if the parent is, the sort who's likely to support this sort of cause, which of course can't be counted upon in every case. Um, Also, I mean, I'm not super internet literate, so I'm not sure how this works, but I know that sometimes people do like fundraisers over social media for different kinds of causes. I have friends who've done this, and I don't think you need to like be 21 in order to participate in them or anything like that, although I'm not sure. Um, so, these seem like options. And even if for whatever reason, a teenager doesn't feel like they're in a position to get money to one of these organizations, they could still kind of spend some time doing some research on which of these organizations might be the most effective for people in their area, in their social circles to participate in. And they could spread the word about these organizations over their social media platforms.
Yeah, definitely. And I think also just in general, getting more educated like about the entire topic as a whole can never be harmful. Um, so yeah, I mean, that kind of like wraps up like the feminist philosophy discussion that I kind of wanted to have today. But I wanted to move on to ethics as a whole, because I think there's like so much we can talk about in ethics. But you've taught a course called Ethics in Society. What are some of the essential questions that you explore in this course, and how can they be valuable on like a daily lifestyle?
Yeah. Um, Great question. So ethics in society is basically an intro level ethics class. It's geared towards majors and non-majors alike. And, you know, different professors teach it differently. In the class that I taught, we did a kind of combination of what are sometimes called like bread and butter normative ethics questions, and also some slightly more topical questions focused on like a particular subject matter. So one of the questions we thought about was, what makes right action right? What makes wrong action wrong? Right. So you might think, or you might hope, that there's some sort of a criterion, right, of wrong action, something that all wrong action would have in common and no right action would satisfy. So, you know, according to one view in ethics that's been really influential, what makes right action right is just that it maximizes good consequences, right? So an action is going to be right on this view just in case it has the best consequences of all the possible alternative actions. And furthermore, it's having the best consequences of all the alternatives is what makes it right, right? So that's a view that's sometimes called consequentialism. And, you know, it contrasts with a number of other views in philosophy that are sometimes called deontological views. And those basically hold that what makes right actions right is not solely a matter of their consequences, right? So an action can have the best consequences, but still be wrong on the sort of contrasting position. So that's one question we talked about. What makes right action right? What makes wrong action wrong? Another question we talked about, what does it take to live a good life? That's a really broad question. So, you know, I think modern ethics is kind of more focused on this first question we talked about, what makes right action right? The ancient Greeks thought about ethics in a kind of broader way. So their primary question was, what does it take to live the good life? And they thought performing morally right actions, that's an important part of living the good life. But a bunch of other things were also part of living the good life, according to the ancient Greeks. So, you know, in addition to doing the morally right thing, it was good if you could be what was sometimes called magnificent. And that basically meant like you could throw really awesome parties for your friends. So that's another question we talked about. One question that we talked about while we were sort of in that unit, which I think some of the students were excited about, was, is it better to be the kind of person who just always feels naturally drawn to do the right thing? Or is it better to be the sort of person who is sometimes tempted to do the wrong thing, but overcomes the temptation to do the right thing anyways? And it was interesting, people seem to have strong feelings about which of these two ways of life is better. So that's another question that we talked about. We also talked about some kind of core questions in political philosophy. So for instance, we talked about which ways of organizing society are just and which are not just. And then we also did a little bit of feminist philosophy. So we talked about the metaphysics of gender a bit, actually. What is this category gender? What makes it different from sex, for instance? So yeah, those are just some examples. I think we read some papers on reparations for slavery. There were more things too. It was kind of a grab bag of topics.
Interesting. That's like really like a lot of topics to kind of discuss. And I guess I'm curious kind of in the way in which you like taught these, or like were these all discussion based, or like how'd you like go about, because there's so many topics and I guess so many different opinions. like, was it all discussion based, or how are these like classes normally taught?
It depends a lot on the particular class. So and the university. So at a lot of US universities, there are kind of big intro level lecture courses. And these courses will have two components. There's the part where you go to lecture. And then usually there's also a part where a smaller group of you go to something called a discussion section or a recitation, it's sometimes called, where there's often a graduate student who helps lead a discussion about some of the things that got discussed in the lecture. So a typical week for my students in that class would look like this. They would read a paper, sometimes two papers, before a meeting of lecture. We'd have a lecture where I would basically kind of take them through the most important issues in the text. I would ask them some questions. They would sometimes ask questions, but most of the class was lecturing. And then later in the week, they would have a discussion section where they would, in a smaller group of maybe 10 to 20 people, have a chance to talk amongst themselves about the sorts of things that we discussed in lecture. And I think, one thing that a lot of students discover when they take a college philosophy course for the first time is that a lot of these questions, which you might have been encouraged to think of as sort of matters of opinion earlier in your life, are actually questions that we can think about in a really rigorous way. We can give reasons for the things that we think. We can be persuaded by reasons that other people give in favor of the competing position. It's not all just like, well, like my feeling on this issue is blah, and that's all there is to say. So yeah, I mean, I think if you haven't taken a college philosophy course before, it's sort of hard to imagine, like, yeah, how would you have a class organized around like questions like what makes right action right? Wouldn't it just be like a bunch of students raising their hand and being like, well, like my feeling is this. And another student would say like, my feeling is this. And then, you would just have like 80 different opinions floating around. And how do you make a class out of that? But, actually there have been like very brilliant people thinking about these questions in a very rigorous way for a very, very long time. And luckily they wrote things down. So we get to read those things. We get to see some of the considerations that, somebody might think tell in favor of a position that seems particularly promising. We can sort of evaluate those considerations. We can read an author who has a different position. And in the end, ideally, you end up having a pretty focused discussion. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And I guess talking more about this rigor, or maybe how like this rigor can implement something in actual lives, like what's the intersection between ethics and action? Like at what point do I realize like, we can talk about like, for example, like the trolley problem or all of these different situations, consequentialism, et cetera. But at what point do like you employ those in your life? Because I feel like a lot of times maybe when we're talking about these problems, we might consider that we're going to do something in that situation, but then if it ever happens in real life, we may not actually do that. So like, how do we go about, or how does ethics influence action?
Do you mean like, so are you asking a question about kind of like human psychology? Like, are you asking if somebody like studies a particular ethical view and comes to endorse it, are they likely to then act in a way that accords with that theory? Or are you asking something else?
More so kind of like the ways in which like discussing ethics can lead to some action. I mean, maybe that's a little bit of human psychology, probably. But in terms of like these discussions that you've had, have like students, I don't know, reflected maybe and said that like, oh, this made me actually reflect and like change the way that my actions happen or something like that. I guess, yeah, maybe it is just a psychological question at that point.
I mean, I think uh, I've definitely heard from students in the past that like, you know, a particular paper we read made them think about some issue really differently and did impact the way that they behaved. Usually when I hear that sort of thing from students, it's about the action in question isn't like something that you would have to do in like a crisis under intense emotional strain. Like I've never had a student like come to me, for instance, and say like, yeah, like I read about the trolley problem, and then like the next day I was in this critical situation and I was able to act on the view that I developed in the course of thinking about the trolley problem. Because, you know, I think as a matter of psychological fact, there are probably certain like instincts that we have that are very hard to override whatever sort of considered view we come to. But you know, I've heard from students before things like, you know, I had a disagreement with my friend the other day. They were upset at me about this thing. I didn't think it made sense for them to be upset at me about that. But then I like read this paper and it made me sort of reevaluate my position on that. And, you know, the other day I went to my friend and I apologized and I said, hey, I see like you really had a point there. So, you know, that's like a very small way in which somebody might change their behavior on the basis of rigorous ethical reflection, but seems like nonetheless a real and important way in which your behavior might change. I think, you know, how much exactly your ethical views influence your behavior is probably going to depend a little bit on what sorts of ethical questions you're considering and what sorts of ethical views you actually end up endorsing. So for instance, if you are some kind of a hardcore consequentialist, so you think that the morally right thing is just that which produces the best consequences, it would be wrong to do anything that doesn't produce the best consequences. And you really follow through on that in your life, like you might have to make some pretty radical changes to the way that you live. So for instance, you probably couldn't be a philosophy professor anymore because this is clearly not the thing that is going to produce like the greatest net benefit in the world. I could, for instance, like do something else that makes a ton of money and then use all the money to buy malaria nets or something. And that would produce better consequences than being a philosopher in all likelihood. So, you know, if I became really convinced of consequentialism in the sort of simple form, and I decided to put that into action, my life would change really dramatically. But, you know, there are other kinds of ethical positions that you could come to endorse where the kind of action that it calls for is not nearly so clear. So for instance, there's a philosopher named T.M. Scanlon, and his view, it's called contractualism sometimes, and this is going to be a dramatic simplification of the view, but the basic thought is what makes wrong action wrong is that it's unjustifiable to other people. So, you know, even when you flesh that view out a little bit more and you see what Scanlon means by unjustifiable, it's not like you arrive at a sort of formula that's going to tell you exactly what to do in any given circumstance, right? So you might come to be convinced of that view, but remain really unsure about, you know, what exactly that view commits you to doing in your own life. And, you know, I think there are actually a lot of ethicists who think to some extent, we just can't get rid of that. So a lot of ethicists think, you know, we're never going to be able to arrive at a kind of perfectly clear algorithm that tells us exactly what the morally right thing to do is in any given situation. Becoming a morally good person is like developing a really complex set of skills. And, it involves making calls about, new kinds of situations that might not bear any very clear resemblance to situations you've encountered in the past. And that's just a certain amount of that is just uneliminable. So even if you, think a lot about ethics, you might think you're never going to get to a point where you just have like a little rule book that will tell you exactly how to act in any given circumstance. Yeah.
So like, I guess in that case, would ethics in a way, or like these discussions contribute or change kind of your personal ethics? Like how you go about life? I guess like what, if you could explain maybe what personal ethics is as well, and how, if it can, how like these discussions can change your personal ethics.
That's an interesting question. I don't know that I've ever heard this phrase personal ethics before. Do you want to just say like a little bit more about what it's supposed to mean?
Yeah, sure. So it's kind of just a response or like a way to identify what someone would adhere to in kind of everyday interactions. So like the way in which you present yourself or go about your life every single day. So not like thinking about like the abstract, like trolley problems, but kind of thinking about like everyday interactions, like going to the store, going to school, and like your decisions that you make and the ethics that you want to have as a person is kind of what I think has been deemed as personal ethics. I don't know if there's like any scholars like that specifically are in their field. I just know that like that's a term that's been used, and that's what kind of it's referring to. And from what you just told me, it seems that like it is possible to change the ways that you act based off of theories like consequentialism or like all of these discussions. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, I do. And I think even if you endorse an ethical theory that yields like less clear prescriptions for action, you're endorsing that ethical theory might shape the way that you think about everyday ethical decisions. So, for instance, a lot of people who are attracted to a view like Scanlon's, the one that I was just talking about, think one sort of element of that view is that when you're considering whether to undertake some course of action, you shouldn't make the decision by just thinking, okay, what are going to be like the net pleasures and the net pains that result from this decision. Rather, you should think about the consequences that your actions will have on each individual person that they stand to affect, considered as an individual, right? So you shouldn't just aggregate all of the pleasures and pains that will happen as a result of your action. You should think for each individual that your action stands to affect, what would that person have to say about my acting in this way? How would this harm them? How would this help them? How would this harm this other person? How would this help this other person? And you should weigh all of those individual objections, right, against the competing considerations, right, rather than aggregating them all together. I'm not sure how intelligible that is without sort of getting into it in more detail and giving examples, but hopefully that gives you a sort of rough sense of these two very different ways of ethical thinking. On one picture, you just think like, okay, all I have to ask myself to know whether to perform this action is this action going to produce more good than bad in general, right? On another way of thinking, you think, no, that's not right. In order to know whether to perform this action, I need to know how this action is going to affect each individual person that the action is going to affect, considered as an individual. So, I think having the latter view doesn't immediately commit you to any particular course of action in every given situation, right? But if you like that view, you're still going to think really differently about a lot of everyday ethical decisions that you might be asked to make than if you had the former kind of view that I described. And so I think even if you endorse an ethical view that doesn't yield like totally crystal clear prescriptions for how to act, it might indeed influence the way that you live your life every day.
Yeah, and I think just like as a whole, it kind of just shows how ethics has a really big influence on your lifestyle. Even though like oftentimes maybe it's not considered to have a really big influence. I think it has a really big influence. And learning about ethics can be really, really valuable, not just to like adults, but also I think to students who are like entering college or like entering the workforce. Like it could be really, really valuable to like explore these questions, because at the end of the day, like ethics and like I guess more maybe moral questions can kind of make you your own individual, right? Like it's your own thoughts and your own opinions and your own feelings on different matters that can be really, really valuable. And I guess like the last question that I have for you is just for people who might be interested more in your research, and maybe about you, I guess, like what are you doing now, and I guess maybe in the fall in the future as well.
Yeah, so most of my research is kind of in the intersection of ethics and epistemology. I think I mentioned earlier, epistemology is like the subdiscipline of philosophy where philosophers ask questions about knowledge and belief. So, a lot of my research touches on questions like, for instance, why is it so important to make sure that we have beliefs that fit the evidence and that we go about acquiring evidence in a sort of clear-eyed, unbiased way? That's one kind of question that some of my research addresses. Another kind of question that's quite in a different area that I've been thinking about recently is, I'm just thinking about how to explain it in the most concise way. So I think there is kind of this sharp divide in feminist theory that sort of goes back to the 70s, where on one side of this divide, you have feminists who think that it's really important to make personal choices about our own lives that are going to serve to erode harmful gender norms and stereotypes, right? So there are feminists who think that, for instance, you as a woman, you should make choices in your own life about how to live that are going to help to erode these kinds of harmful stereotypes and norms. And then there are other feminists who think like, no, our choices about how to live, these sorts of personal choices that these other feminists think should be influenced by political considerations, they're just too personal to be constrained by the kinds of political considerations that these other feminists are appealing to. Everybody should just present their gender in whatever way feels most comfortable to them. You don't have any kind of an ethical or political obligation to use your own gender presentation to undermine problematic gender norms and stereotypes. And I'm interested in understanding better what the considerations are in favor of each of these views and how we might ultimately arrive at some kind of a position that respects all of the most important considerations on each side of the divide. So, that's just another thing I'm thinking about that's a little bit separate from my core research area, but might be of interest to some people.
Yeah, definitely. And what I can do is maybe I can like link your website in the description, so that if anyone's interested, you guys can just check it out. And I think there's like a research tab in which you can click and kind of go through all that research. But that about wraps up our discussion today. Thank you so much, Dr. Dandelet, for your time today. I learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience did as well. And there's always a powerful message to learn from just learning ethics in general. So thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Saurish.